Hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming today, and thank you, Sarah, for having me here. I have a passion of sharing nutrition and how to eat healthy for cancer prevention, cancer survival, and I want to give you just a little bit of background about myself before I get into the presentation. So my name is Melissa Mouton. I'm a dietitian. I went to school I'm from Texas, but I went to school in Washington, Seattle, Washington, at Bastyr University, and received my master in nutrition degree there. And then I did my internship to become a dietitian at the University of Washington in Seattle. So I don't know if anyone's heard of Bastyr University before. It's a little small private school in Seattle, Washington area, but it's an alternative medical school where they train naturopath physicians, acupuncturists, and those types of professions. They also have a nutrition program. And then, so I did that component to have sort of more of the alternative education and training. And then I went to the University of Washington to get the more traditional, conventional training as well. So I had sort of both components of that. And after finishing my internship, I worked for several years at the Seattle Cancer Care Alliance there in Seattle as a registered dietitian. I don't know if anyone has heard of the Seattle Cancer Care Alliance. It's very similar for that region to the MD Anderson for our region here. But anyways, why do I have such an interest in cancer? Well, in '97, I was diagnosed with cervical cancer, and luckily it was caught early, and I just needed surgery, nothing major. I didn't have to have chemotherapy or anything real severe like a lot of others have had for their cancers. But at that point, I really got interested in learning more about nutrition and its effects on cancer survival. And others in my family had been diagnosed with cancer as well. So it really struck home with me to learn more about nutrition and cancer. And so that led me on my journey to eventually becoming a dietitian. Anyway, so that's what brings me here today, to share my passion with you in healthy eating and how the foods that we eat can affect our survival of cancer and preventing cancer if you haven't had it already, preventing recurrence, or preventing other types of cancers from coming about. So here's our agenda for today, and you can see in your packets you have the presentation to follow along with. There is one slide that you will see in there that has a lot of stuff on it going on, and you have a separate handout later in the packet on that particular slide. That's an up close so that you'll be able to see everything that's on that slide, and I'll go over it with you and make it a lot more easier to understand. So why nutrition is important? We're going to talk about that today, and we will discuss aspects of something called the World Cancer Research Fund Expert Report. I know that's a really long title. Has anybody heard of that before? Okay. So what this report is, in 2000, well, I'm not exactly sure when they started doing this, but a large group of about 100, well, more than 100, I believe, in the hundreds of scientific researchers decided to get together from all over the world. Different scientists from all over the world decided to get together and do a review of all of the available research on diet and cancer and say, okay, there's been all this research done throughout the years. What do we know? What is it telling us? And so hundreds of scientists got together. They formed different committees. They came together and reviewed thousands and thousands of research studies because they wanted to determine what can we recommend to the public. You know, we've been doing this research for quite some time. What can we say? What do we really know? What is the research telling us? So the report that they finally came up with included 8 recommendations for things that people can do to help reduce the risk of cancer, getting cancer, as well as reducing the risk of cancer recurrence. The report is actually a 500-page, like this thick report that you can get on their website. The link is there in your packet of information. But we're just going to go over some of the aspects. The 8 recommendations. We'll cover the ones that deal with dietary changes. Some of the recommendations dealt with exercise recommendations. Others dealt with controlling weight. And then there were some specific dietary pattern recommendations that we're going to talk about. And then as we're talking about that, you'll start to see that certain dietary patterns tend to promote cancer development, and other dietary patterns tend to reduce our risk of cancer development, as well as reduce our risk of recurrence of cancer once we've already been diagnosed. And in seeing those patterns emerge, what we learn is that there are 4 particular food groups that we would be doing really well if we focus on getting more of those in our diet. And that's called the new 4 food groups. So we'll talk about what the new 4 food groups are. That's something that was developed by Dr. Neil Barnard of the Physicians Committee of Responsible Medicine, PCRM. And so I'll talk about those 4 food groups, and then we'll talk about, well, how can we make this work for us in our real life? What are some practical applications of what we're talking here about today, how we can go home and start consuming these recommended foods in a realistic situation. Okay, so I did say nutrition is important in cancer prevention, but also in cancer survival and preventing a recurrence of cancer. There have been so many research studies out there that have shown a link between cancer and diet, and it ranges from breast cancer to colon cancer, all of the different types of cancers. There's been shown some type of link with diet. And that report that I was telling you about, they went back and looked at all of those research studies. So it included everything from breast cancer to colon cancer, prostate cancer, stomach cancer, pancreatic cancer. Everything was included in what they looked at. They did analyze the studies very closely for things like, is this a well-designed study? Did it include enough participants? And that sort of thing. And kind of sort out the ones that were not well-designed studies. But so a lot of research is out there. What about genetics? I remember growing up and thinking that the way you get cancer is because you have bad genes. Yeah, because it's in your family, it's your genetics. What have you guys heard? Like, what do you think the percentage? Let's take breast cancer, because that one's in my mind right now. What is the numbers in my mind? What is the percentage, do you think, of breast cancer cases that are attributed to genetics, purely genetics? It is low, yeah. So those are pretty close in there. It's about 5%. Yeah. So it's pretty low. 5% of the cases of breast cancer that are purely related to genetics is 5%. Yeah, that's not as much as I would have thought before I started learning about all of this. So most of the breast cancer cases out there are dietary related. Prostate cancer, same thing. Stomach cancer, many of the cancers out there are mostly genetic. Even leukemia. There is certainly a genetic component, but there's environmental components as well. Part of that being diet, part of that being exposure to other toxins in the environment. Oh, sorry. Okay. So why is diet so important? What role does diet have to play? Well, when we look at the growth process, or the process of cancer development, it gets a little bit clearer to us how cancer is related to diet and other things in our environment. If you'll look towards the back of your handout, of your packet, you will find this slide in a better format, a larger format, that you can actually read. So, yeah. So we're going to go over this and talk about the cancer growth process and understand how diet plays a role in that. Different dietary patterns can cause a different scenario to occur in our bodies. So let's look at the first row, the very top row there, right up here. So what we see here on the left is a healthy DNA cell in our healthy little individual there. So our healthy cell with healthy DNA inside. But all of us, no matter if we've had cancer or not, we all have exposure to things in our environment or through our diet. Oops, sorry about that. We have things called carcinogens in our diet and in our environment that can cause damage to those healthy DNA cells. Those things, those carcinogens, create things in our bodies called electrophiles, or also known as free radicals. I'm sure you've heard that term before. Does anyone want me to explain what a free radical is? Does that need to be explained? Okay. Okay, good. I think everyone's heard about free radicals by now. So there are different things such as viruses, pesticides, compounds called heterocyclic amines that are created when meats are cooked at high temperatures, nitrites and nitrates that are found in certain foods, especially processed foods, tobacco, preservatives, plastics like BPA in plastic. So these different types of things are carcinogens. They can initiate the process of cancer development. All right, let's go down to the next row here. This is the scenario that occurs when we have a lot of plant foods in our diet. Now, what do I mean by plant foods? Vegetables, yes. Greens, all kinds of vegetables. Fruit, yes, absolutely. Anything that comes from a plant. So also we would be talking about grains and legumes, which are beans, peas, and lentils. So all of those types of foods that come from plants are what I'm talking about when I say plant-based diet or plant foods. So when we have more of those types of foods in our diet, what we find is that the free radicals that attack our healthy cells, attack that DNA in our cells, they are blocked and removed by antioxidants that we get from eating those plant foods, such as broccoli and other plant foods. So the antioxidants that are very high in those foods can sever the bond between that free radical that's attached to our DNA and cause damage, and it can help to even reverse the damage that may have occurred. There are also other compounds in fruits and vegetables and other plant foods called phytochemicals, and these are just plant nutrients that are developed in the plant to protect the plant, but they also protect our cells when we eat the plants. So these phytochemicals can surround our healthy cells, protect them from any free radical damage occurring. This is a very sort of basic explanation. It's not real, technical biochemistry, so just, for the layperson to understand. But essentially, when we eat antioxidants, plants and other, fruits, vegetables, other plant foods, we create this situation in our body that protects our cells and protects our DNA from damage. So then what happens is those free radicals, when we're eating a diet that's high in plant foods, carcinogens can more easily be removed from our body. And part of what allows us to do that is fiber. So plant foods have a lot of fiber in them. Fiber is involved in helping us to remove carcinogens from our bodies, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. And then if we had a diet that was based more on animal foods, so like my brother, meat and potatoes guy who hardly eats any vegetables, although he's getting a little better. I'm working on him. But anyways, an animal-based diet is one that when we get the free radicals attaching our DNA, if we don't have a lot of antioxidants in there from plant foods, they're not going to be able to protect that DNA. And the free radicals can do more damage and harm, and more likely then that we will see that develop into a tumor a cancerous cell which could potentially metastasize. So all of the steps in the cancer process, initiation, promotion, and progression of that cancer, none of that is halted when the diet is based on mostly animal foods, because you don't have those plant foods, those phytochemicals, and those antioxidants in there to protect the cells and stop this from occurring and remove some of those carcinogens. So that's just a little bit about the cancer process, the development of cancer, and how different things in our diet can have an effect on that. Another thing that I didn't mention on here is alcohol. And animal foods and alcohol are both, they both promote inflammation in the body and promote cancer growth. Alcohol in too high of amounts has been associated with increased breast cancer risk. So that's something that we want to be careful with too. Doesn't mean we can't have any alcohol at all. But we do need to be aware that alcohol does promote inflammation in the body, and inflammation is a process that can encourage cancer development. All right. So I mentioned that these 8 personal recommendations of the World Cancer Research Fund expert report tell us what different types of foods we should focus on. So let's go through some of their recommendations. One of the first recommendations of the 8 has to do with the food type, or the type of food that is consumed. So what they said, and this is quoted from the report, is that we should consume calorie-dense foods sparingly, such as donuts, cakes, pies, cookies, those types of things. That's what calorie-dense means, foods that have lots of calories in them but very little nutrients. So why do you think this would be one of the recommendations, avoiding calorie-dense foods? So part of it has to do with fat, part of it has to do with sugar. A lot of it has to do with the fact that if we have a lot of these types of food in our diet, we're filling up on these types of foods, and we're getting our calories, we're getting some fat, we're getting some sugar, we're getting some carbohydrate, but we're not getting the other important nutrients that we need to fight cancer, and that includes all the antioxidants and phytochemicals and fiber that I mentioned earlier. So these foods are devoid of those things. So if we fill up on these things, we don't have room in our diet for the others. Also, these types of foods promote weight gain, and weight gain, as the researchers explained in the report, is associated with increased risk of cancer, especially breast cancer. And the amount of fat in our diet is also associated with increased cancer risk. For example, there is a study called the Women's Intervention Study, the WINS study, W-I-N-S. And in this study, they found that women that reduced their fat intake to a low-fat diet had a much lower risk of breast cancer recurrence. For those women that were estrogen receptor positive, the reduction in risk of recurrence was 15%. So they had 15% less risk of getting a cancer recurrence than if they were not following the low-fat diet. For those who were estrogen receptor negative, so ER negative breast cancer, those women, sorry, the light is sort of distracting. Those women actually had a 42% reduction in the rate of recurrence. So for the women that were estrogen receptor negative, estrogen receptor negative, they were following the low-fat diet, they were 42% less likely to get a recurrence of breast cancer. So that's a pretty big reduction in your risk, 42%. That's the WINS study. And I can get that reference for you if you're interested in looking at that study. But that's just one of the research studies out there. There are lots of research studies out there on fat. I'm sure you guys have probably, this isn't new news, right? I'm sure you've heard that fat is associated with cancer risk, especially breast cancer and prostate cancer. Let's talk a little bit about fiber. Yes?
Can we go back to fat for just a second?
Sure.
Does it depend on what kind of fat? Is it animal fat or is flaxseed oil fat acceptable?
Well, I would say that flaxseed oil is an acceptable thing to have in your diet, but when the research studies look at fat and cancer, what they've looked at is total fat intake. So what's important to think about is what's the total amount of fat in the diet. Of course, the types of fats are important too. But if we're eating just flaxseed oil or just healthy oils, just healthy fats, and we have an excessive amount of it, so we're having a really large amount of it in our diet, still not a good thing. Yes? Yeah. Like in a day, like how many tablespoons of oil in a day? I would, if I had to give a recommendation of amount of tablespoons of oil to use in a day, I would probably say maybe about 1 or 2 tablespoons, not a lot. But what I really recommend, and you'll see in just a moment, is that trying to keep oils to a minimum, because it really does add up quickly, the amount of calories and then the amount of fat. And trying to rely on actual foods to get the fats that you need to get those healthy fats. So flaxseed, for example, have the ground flaxseed instead of the flaxseed oil, because you're getting a lot more nutrients in the flaxseed than just the oil. The oil's just fat. So, yeah. Okay, so let's talk about fiber then. A moment ago I said we would talk about that a little bit more and how fiber has an effect on our cancer risk. So we've heard so much about how fiber helps our digestion and all those kinds of things, right? We know those benefits of fiber, but did you know that fiber also helps reduce our risk of getting cancer and fighting cancer when we have it? Yeah, it's really important. And let me explain why that is. Your body is constantly filtering your blood to remove things like toxins that we don't want to be there that can contribute to cancer development. Excess hormones. We need a certain amount of estrogen and testosterone in our body, but when we get too much, it can stimulate hormone-sensitive cancers like estrogen receptor positive breast cancer. So your body, your liver is filtering those excess hormones out of your blood. It filters cholesterol, but not that that has to do with cancer. It filters excess, other carcinogens that might be in your body. It gets those things, takes them out of your blood. Now, what does the liver do with these things? Anybody know? What does the liver do with those? Right. So what the liver does with these things is it takes them and dumps them into our intestines. Well, what happens then? Well, if we eat a diet that has lots of plant food, so lots of fiber, the fiber comes along, attaches to those things, and escorts them out of our body. So escorts those carcinogens out of the body, escorts those excess estrogens out of the body. Well, what happens if we don't have fiber there? What if so it doesn't actually just sit there. If we don't have fiber there, what happens is those excess hormones, the cholesterol, the toxins, all those carcinogens that can cause cancer, those actually get reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. And as they go back into the bloodstream, there they are again to do their damage. And then the liver finds them again and says, hey, what are you doing here? I got rid of you. It takes those things again, puts them back into the intestines. And if fiber's still not there, it sends them right back. And so all the while you have these toxins or excess hormones circulating throughout your blood and can cause problems for us. So that's why fiber is so important to help us remove those things from the body. Does anyone know what the typical American diet amount of fiber is, the average fiber intake for typical American diets? It's right around that, 10 to 12 grams of fiber a day. 10 to 12 grams of fiber a day is the sort of typical intake that we see. How about the recommendations of fiber intake from, say, the U.S. Department of Agricultural, American Dietetic Association kind of recommendations?
30.
It's 25 to 30, or 20 to 35, somewhere around there. 25 to 30 grams per day. So, and that's 25 for men, or 25 a day for women, and 30 grams a day for men is what the U.S. Department of Agriculture recommendations are for fiber intake. So, typical American diet, around 10 to 12 grams. Recommendations for the general public is 25 to 30 grams. But what do the research studies show? When we look at the research studies that are done showing fiber and its effects on reducing cancer, such as colon cancer and other cancers, the research is showing that a diet that has more like 40 to 50 grams of fiber a day is going to be most beneficial. That's quite a bit of fiber, right? It's a lot more than the typical American diet. Now, why did they make the recommendations low at 20 to 30, 25 to 30 grams? If the research says we need to have more like 40 grams a day. Well, it has to do with when they're making those types of recommendations, it's for the general public, and they have to look at where are they now and what can we expect them to achieve. And so they kind of base it on that, and they kind of aim a little low. But when we, as cancer survivors, we really, in my opinion, should be looking at what's the research showing, and let's take in that amount of fiber. And that's what I try to do as best as I can every day. And that's what I encourage my patients that come see me in my private practice. So that is fiber and how it has an effect on cancer. The other recommendation then, so this one had to do with the food type in general. The other recommendation that the committee came up with was to eat mostly foods of plant origin. Again, that's quoting from the report. The recommendation is to eat mostly foods of plant origin. Yes. Come on up.
So the thing that really troubles me there is smoothies in general,
Okay.
because if I put a blender full of blueberries and strawberries that are organic,
Yeah.
and I put a little bit of juice and some soy milk in there, am I not supposed to be doing that? Because the information you've given before is those things are packed full of what I want to get.
Absolutely, you should do that. That's
But it
great.
says up there that I should avoid smoothies in
Where
the
did
last
it-
slide.
Oh, in the last, that's talking about not your healthy smoothie.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right.
Sorry, that's a great question. Thank you so much for asking that, because that is such a great question. Thank you. No, have your smoothies, please. Please have your healthy smoothies like that. Yes. Not the unhealthy where you're adding all the sugar and chocolate. Yes, a healthy fruit smoothie, go for it. Please. I have one every day. Put some kale in there too. Yep. Okay. So yes, it does say to eat mostly foods of plant origin, and to make those real plant foods, real whole foods, or whole foods. Whole foods I like to describe as being a food that's real. An example would be an apple versus an apple fruit roll-up. Fruit roll-up isn't really a real food. Very processed. Through all of that processing, we really lose a lot of the essence of what that fruit can provide to us for fighting cancer. The whole apple is going to be a much better deal. Another example would be potatoes. And white potatoes get such a bad rap, But a white potato without adding all the cheese and sour cream and all that on it actually is really healthy and good for us. It has lots of vitamin C, lots of fiber. Sweet potatoes are great too, and you get some extra antioxidants from the sweet potatoes. But an example of whole food versus not a whole food, a potato, you can imagine that growing in the garden, versus a potato chip. So you can't go pick a potato chip out of the garden and eat it. So if you can imagine it growing in the garden, yeah, it's a whole food. So staying away from those more processed foods. So when the researchers were looking at the different studies, they came up with the recommendation to have more plant foods in the diet. Well, it makes sense that the next recommendation, we're going to get to that in just a moment. The next recommendation was to consume animal foods less often. Now, why do you think that would be, based on what we've already talked about today? A lot of it does have to do with fat content. So we get a lot of fat, and we talked about fat and how that's associated with cancer risk and risk of recurrence of cancer. So animal foods are high in fat, but what do they not have? What are they lacking in? Fiber. So there's no fiber in animal foods. Vitamins, minerals. Yeah, there are certain minerals and vitamins that are in animal foods, but the antioxidant types of vitamins and minerals we don't find in animal foods. What about all of those phytochemicals that I mentioned? Those are only in plant foods. So we don't find the phytochemicals, which are so important for fighting cancer, and we don't find fiber. So when we fill up on animal foods, we're getting a lot of fat, which we know is not good for cancer. We're potentially also getting those carcinogens that I talked about earlier, and I'll go over those again in just a moment. But we're not getting the things that we need to fight cancer, and so that's why it can be that's why it makes sense that these research studies are showing that the more animal foods in the diet, the more likely someone gets cancer. The less animal foods and more plant foods in the diet, the less likely they are to get cancer. Animal foods have carcinogenic compounds that form when the meats are cooked. One of those is called HCAs. Have you heard of that before? HCAs, heterocyclic amines. Those are DNA damaging compounds that are created when the meat is cooked, and the longer and the hotter that the meat is cooked, the more of those HCAs are formed. The charring is part of it, but not just the charring. The internal portion of the meat will have the HCAs created in that meat tissue as the meat is cooked for a long time at a very hot temperature. So what I'm talking about is grilling and frying and oven broiling at a high temperature. Those will all create those heterocyclic amines in the meat, and any kind of meat. Yeah, any kind of animal. Yeah, so it's the animal tissue. It's that muscle. It's creatinine is the amino acid that's in the tissue of animal meats, chicken, whatever it is, wild game, everything has a lot of creatinine in it. We don't see very much of that amino acid in plant foods at all. It's an animal type amino acid that we see, and it's that creatinine that converts to those dangerous compounds. So it doesn't mean that somebody can't have wild game now and then. It just means that when someone's diet consists primarily of those foods, they're going to be getting a lot of those compounds in their body. So they want to help fight that by getting more plant foods in the diet. Another type of compound is called PAHs, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. And these are especially associated with stomach cancer, but these types of compounds are formed whenever meat is grilled over an open flame, and you have the fat that drips down into the heat, and then the flame, it causes the flame to flare up. Have you seen that happen? when the meat drips down, and it flares up, and those flames consist of these compounds, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. So those are formed when the meat fat drips down into the flame and then comes up in the flame. And then those compounds adhere to the meat tissue and are a carcinogen in our body. So we do have to be careful with the amounts of grilling of meats. All right, let's go back a little bit. So speaking of plant foods, as I was just earlier, you have a handout in your package. After the presentation there, you will see this handout, the top 10 cancer-fighting foods. So if we want to really pack in some of these plant foods to help fight against cancer, to help us fight any of those toxins or carcinogens that may be getting into our body by other foods that we eat or things in the environment, then we want to really load up on these top cancer-fighting foods that are all plant foods. And in your handout that you'll get to take home, it does go through each one of these and explain specifically why this is a top cancer-fighting food. So it goes into the detail. We don't have time tonight for me to go through each one individually, but you do have all of that there. And you can always feel free to email me any questions that you may have about any of that. All right. Also, I did bring, I don't know if anyone had a chance to try it yet, a whole food recipe. It's called low-fat bean dip. Did anyone try it back there? Yeah. Do you like it? Good. Good, good. It's usually a big hit, and it's so easy to make. It's low-fat black bean dip. Yeah. So most of the bean dips that you'll buy in the store are loaded with oil, lots of fat. This one doesn't have any oil in it at all. The only fat that it has is from the black beans, which have virtually no fat. It's a teeny tiny amount, so very small amount. Very easy to make. You just take a can, or if you want to cook your own black beans, that's even better, but you can take a can of black beans, drain and rinse them, throw them in your blender or food processor with a half a cup of your favorite salsa, whatever you like. And if you like, a teaspoon of cumin and maybe a teaspoon or half a teaspoon of salt. That was the recipe I used. And blend it up and you're good to go. So very easy and very tasty, and that's a whole foods, plant-based, cancer-fighting recipe. Okay, and just on alcohol, I did talk about this already, but just the recommendations in the report are that that you consume a small amount if you do drink alcohol, less than or equal to 2 drinks a day for men, and less than or equal to 1 drink a day for women is what they recommend. So we don't get to have as much as the men. That's okay. I'm happy with my 1 glass of wine a day. My 1 glass of red wine. That's good. And then 1 drink is equivalent to what it says there. The recommendations also have to do with food processing and preservation. The research study showed that the more salt-cured foods, the more processed foods that were in the diet, the more chance people got cancer. So those also, it's recommended to keep to a minimum. And it actually, the recommendations that they came up with actually said to avoid salt-preserved food, or very salty foods. Now, you can use some salt in your recipes like I did. That's not what they're talking about. They're talking about very highly salted foods and limiting the consumption of processed foods. And then this recommendation also included avoiding pesticides as much as possible. Now, it's not possible to completely avoid pesticides. We're gonna get some of it, but to do the best that you can and try to eat organic as much as you can. And I know that's not always possible, and I like to be realistic and practical when I'm talking to people, so I share these recommendations with you that the science shows, And then, okay, let's step back, and which we'll do in a moment, and let's talk about, well, okay, how do we make this work? Let's be realistic here. So you have a handout in your packets called the Dirty Dozen. What this is the list from the Environmental Working Group of the top 12 most heavily pesticide residue produce. So the U.S. Department of Agriculture measures the amount of pesticide residue in fruits and vegetables in our food supply. And the Environmental Working Group took that list and they looked at which ones have the most pesticide residue. And those were these 12, so they call it the Dirty Dozen. These are the ones that have the most. So the reason I'm showing you that is because I know I'm on a budget and I can't afford to get every single thing organic all the time. It can be more expensive to do that. I try as best as I can, but at least try to get these as organic. If you can't get everything organic, at least try to get these organic. That way you will be cutting down on a lot of the pesticides that you're getting in. So I try to get it all organic. Sometimes I need a certain thing and they just don't have it in organic. So if it's not on the Dirty Dozen list, then I feel a little better about getting that one. Okay, let's see how we're doing on time. I'm sorry, I'm just going to briefly cover moldy grains. Aflatoxins are in moldy grains that have kind of gone moldy, and you can tell that by looking at it. If it smells musty, it's probably moldy, and aflatoxins can cause cancer, especially liver cancer, so we want to avoid moldy grains as well. Vitamin D, this is not part of the recommendations that is discussed in the report that I mentioned, but I did want to mention this because it is really important that we have enough vitamin D if we want to prevent cancer and prevent cancer recurrence. And I encourage everyone to have your vitamin D level checked. Has anybody had your vitamin D level checked? Good, 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 good. I highly encourage you to do that because there really is quite a bit of vitamin D deficiency in our country. Even in Texas, where we get lots of sunshine, we still just really aren't out in the sun frequently enough, or if we go out in the sun, we cover up with sunscreen, and that blocks our ability to make vitamin D from the sun. There are not a lot of great food sources of vitamin D. So it's the sun, and we don't want to get skin cancer, or a few foods. Yes?
I heard something about vitamin D3.
Uh-huh.
Would you
Okay.
recommend that? I mean, what's the difference?
Okay, sure. That's a great question. So the question was, she had heard something about vitamin D3. So there are two forms of vitamin that are available to us, vitamin D that are available to us. Vitamin D2 is a synthetic form of vitamin D that's created in a lab. Vitamin D3 is the natural form that we create in our bodies when the sun hits our skin. Vitamin D2 is not as potent as vitamin D3, and it takes a lot more of vitamin D2 to give us the equivalent activity in our bodies as vitamin D3. Vitamin D2 you find added to milk, the vitamin D that they add to milk or to fortified foods like cereals. That is vitamin D2 that they use, is the synthetic vitamin D. Nowadays, we're starting to see a lot more of the supplements available of vitamin D3, but you want to look at that. There still are supplements out there that are vitamin D2. I recommend that you get vitamin D3 if you are going to get a supplement of vitamin D. But get your level checked first. There's no sense in spending a lot of money on a supplement if you don't need it. So have your level checked. If it's not in the recommended ranges, then you'll want to supplement. Your doctor will probably put you on a high dose of vitamin D supplement to begin with if you're low, and then a maintenance dose after that. So I just can't stress enough, there's been a lot of research showing an association between vitamin D and various disease conditions, especially cancer, breast cancer, and prostate cancer in particular. So definitely check your vitamin D levels. And what about soy? So we're talking about getting more plant foods in the diet and having more of a plant-based diet. And a lot of times the question comes up, well, what about soy? I've heard it's so bad for you, and I'm not eating soy. And that's fine, first of all. You don't have to eat soy to eat a plant-based diet, right? There's lots of other plant foods out there. But a lot of people do like to include it in their diet. And there's a lot of controversy, a lot of misinformation out there on soy. So I want to just talk about that just a little bit. You do have a handout, though, in your packets. It's about 3 pages, and it's from the American Dietetic Association. And it's called The Safety of Soy Foods. So I encourage you to read through that, and that'll probably answer a lot of your questions that you may have as well. But anyway, soy has been shown in research to have heart-healthy benefits. And it does contain something called phytoestrogens, which are weak estrogens. So they're not exactly like the structure of estrogen in our bodies, but it's similar in structure. And what it can do is actually bind to those estrogen receptors in our body. And the research has shown, and also when they look at population studies, and what that means is you look at a group of people in certain populations, so like Japanese population or American population. So when they look at Japanese, Chinese populations that have a lot of soy in their diet, they find that they have reduced rates of cancer, especially breast cancer and prostate cancer. They have increased rates, though, of stomach cancer, but they have lower rates of breast cancer. They have more soy in the diet. So what's going on there? If these things are kind of looking like estrogen and they're attaching to those estrogen receptors, is that not going to stimulate those estrogen receptors and cause breast cancer? That doesn't seem to be what's happening when you look at the research studies. But what doctors or scientists sort of hypothesize is that when those receptors bind to the estrogen receptors, when the phytoestrogens, the soy estrogens, bind to the estrogen receptors, they actually kind of block the regular estrogen from being able to bind there. And then the regular estrogen can't stimulate cancer to occur. So the phytoestrogen kind of parks in the place where the regular estrogen wants to park and won't let it come in there and do what it wants to do. Some of the most recent research studies with regards to breast cancer and soy intake have actually, and these have come out within the last couple of years, I think even this year, one of the studies, but it showed that those with breast cancer had less recurrence if they were having more soy in their diet. So those with more soy in their diet had less recurrence of breast cancer. Yes? Okay, yes. So it says up here, whole soy. So let's talk about that. So if we look at those population studies, Japanese, Chinese populations that have less breast cancer, and they're eating a lot of soy, and soy seems to be having some kind of health benefit to us. Well, if we look at what they're eating whole soy foods. They're not eating processed soy foods. So a whole soy food is a soy food that's in its closest to its natural state. So let me give you some examples. Tofu, edamame, which is little green soybeans, soy nuts, tempeh, which is fermented soybeans that are mashed together. Those types of things are whole soy foods. Miso is another one. It's sort of like a paste. It's mashed up soybeans. Those are whole soy foods that we see being eaten in those populations that have less breast cancer, that consume high soy amounts. Processed soy food is your soy hot dog, your soy lunch meat, soy isolate protein, which is just soy protein taken out of the soybean and added to all kinds of things in our food supply these days, from crackers and chips to granola bars. Lots of processed soy like that is in our food supply. Soy milk is somewhat processed, but it isn't as processed as those things. The soy milk in Asian countries is even less processed than the soy milk we get here, but the recommendation from most cancer experts that recommend soy intake say that soy milk is considered a whole soy food and would be okay to have. Mm-hmm.
Soy sauce? Soy sauce.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Soy sauce is basically just mashing soybeans, taking the liquid. So it's not like an extremely chemical process altering of the soy or anything. So soy sauce in your diet would be okay to have. Yeah. How am I doing on time? Okay. I have till 8, right? Okay. Thank you. Any other questions on soy? Yes.
Do you want me to come up to the microphone?
Yes, please.
I've just heard that soybeans, lately I've heard a lot of controversy about how they're treated and that they're very high in pesticides and to buy organic if you can.
Okay.
So is that, do you know?
That's a
It's
very
true.
good question. Yes, so I do encourage that you buy soy as an organic form. Yes, absolutely. And part of the reason for that is to avoid the pesticides. But another reason is that if soy, the way it is here in our country, because they don't label genetically modified organisms, genetically modified foods, if you get soy that's not organic, you're pretty much guaranteed it's going to be genetically modified. So I tend to like to avoid the genetically modified stuff. So yeah, I would definitely encourage that you get organic soy if you're going to have any soy products. Make sure that it's not genetically modified. So unfortunately, they don't have a requirement in our country to label that so that consumers can know if it contains that or not. But organic standards don't allow genetically modified organisms. So if it's organic, then you know it doesn't have it. Or at least you hope that it doesn't have it. Any other questions on soy? Okay. So far, these recommendations that we've talked about, we've said, less calorie-dense foods, less fat in the diet, more fiber in the diet, more plant foods, more fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, and less animal foods. Why these recommendations? Here's a summary of why these recommendations are made. High fiber. And we talked about how fiber helps to prevent cancer and cancer recurrence. Also, these foods have lots of antioxidants. So when we eat foods that have lots of plant foods, we get lots of antioxidants. We also get lots of phytochemicals. Let me mention a couple of phytochemicals. I don't know if I covered that well earlier. You may have heard of things like beta-carotene or lycopene. Have you heard of those terms? Those are what we call phytochemicals. And they're not, beta-carotene actually gets converted to vitamin A in our body, so in a sense, beta-carotene is a vitamin. But most of these phytochemicals that I'm talking about, and there's hundreds and hundreds of them in plant foods, most of them are not vitamins. They're not minerals. They're just other compounds in the plant foods that have a health benefit to us. Lycopene is really high in tomatoes and helps fight prostate cancer. There's another compound called allium that's in garlic, and it helps strengthen our immune system and fight cancer cells. And actually, whenever you chop or crush the garlic, it activates enzymes in the garlic that activate the allium, that phytochemical, and allow it to be able to do its job. So I always like to encourage people whenever you are cooking and you're chopping some garlic and some onions and other vegetables, chop your garlic first. They've actually done research on this. You chop your garlic first because it needs to sit for 7 to 10 minutes after it's been chopped for those enzymes to fully activate the allium. Because once you throw your garlic into the heat source and start cooking, it destroys those enzymes that activate the allium. It doesn't destroy the allium, so you're still going to get that in your body when you cook it, but it just destroys the enzymes that activate the allium. So let it sit 7 to 10 minutes while you're chopping everything else, and then start cooking with the garlic. So phytochemicals, phytonutrients are all these other things besides vitamins and minerals in our plant foods that help us fight cancer. This type of diet pattern with more plant foods in your diet also helps us to avoid toxins that can be formed in the foods, like the heterocyclic amines and those sorts of things that promote cancer development. It's also very anti-inflammatory, and remember, an anti-inflammatory diet helps to keep cancer down, reduce cancer development. So following these recommendations can help to boost your immunity and fight cancer and fight it from coming back. So if we looked at these recommendations, then it sounds like the foods that we're talking about that we need to have the most of in our diet are from these 4 groups. This is the new 4 food groups that I mentioned earlier. So fruits, legumes just means beans, peas, and lentils, whole grains, and vegetables. This is just sort of a general recommendation of how many to have from each serving, or from each group, how many servings from each group. You want to try to at least get that, but you may need to have more calories, and so then you would want to have more from each group. Something that's not on here that also does have some fiber and some phytonutrients and vitamins and minerals that are good for fighting cancer are nuts and seeds. So Dr. Bernard is, I don't know if you know who he is, he's a cancer expert doctor who started the Cancer Project. But anyways, through the research, it really does show that the lower amount of fat in your diet, the better for fighting cancer and fighting cancer recurrence. So his recommendations are very, very low on fat. So he doesn't even include nuts and seeds in here. I generally say, and if you talk to him, he'll say, well, it doesn't mean you can't have those things. It just means we don't want to see you having tons of it every day. So about 1/4 cup of nuts a day is a good rule of thumb on the recommendation there. So not going overboard with it. And the reason for that is they are really high in fat. So yes, they have other things in them that are good for us, but they do have a very concentrated source of fat. It really adds up fast. So you just do want to keep it to a minimum, but doesn't mean you shouldn't have them at all. Okay, so far, it sounds like I'm telling you guys, you can't have any meat. You can't have any chicken, any kind of meats, right? You can't have any milk or eggs right? Well, I like to kind of step back at this point and talk about real life. And the way I like to describe it is sort of like a continuum. At this end of the spectrum, you have the worst possible diet. That's the most cancer-causing diet you can think of. That's all animal foods, lots of saturated fat, lots of red meats being cooked at high temperatures for long times, and no vegetables, right, at this end of the spectrum. And then at this end of the spectrum, you have the optimal diet that research is showing lots of plant-based foods, following the 4 food group method, and having tons of cancer fighters in your foods. So what you want to think about is, well, where do you fall on that continuum? And, are you here? Okay, well, let's talk about how you can get more of the good food, the plant foods, the cancer-fighting foods in your diet, and move you a little more over here. Or maybe you're here, and so maybe you want to get even more plant foods in your diet. So I meet people where they are and say, okay, I don't want to focus on what we're telling you to take out of your diet. I want to focus on what will fight your cancer and what foods we want to start putting in your diet. And so let's talk about what those foods are and how you can get more of those foods in your diet. And what will naturally occur when you're getting more of those foods in your diet, you'll naturally will eat less of the other foods that don't provide the health benefits. But it doesn't mean you have to be all the way 100% over here or you're going to die. So there's a balance, and everyone is different in their situation and where they are and how much more of the plant foods they can get in the diet. So the research definitely shows, it's pretty clear, research shows more plant foods the better, but we have to be realistic and work with. So in my private practice, I work with each individual and see, okay, where you are, and let's develop a plan that's specifically for you and get the most cancer fighters in there. But that's sort of just the general overview of what the research is showing us, and how to, really fight our cancer with food, because such a huge percentage of our cancer rate, of our cancer recurrence rate, is related to what we put in our bodies. So bottom line, the more plant foods in your diet, the better. So just work towards that. Oop, I keep doing this upside down. All right, well, how do we do that? How do we get more fruits and vegetables and other plant foods in our diet? Eat a variety every day. So try to start thinking about fruits and vegetables early in the day rather than waiting till dinner. So that can mean having a spinach tofu scramble or bell peppers and red peppers sauteed with some onion and garlic and some potato. Makes a great breakfast. So start thinking earlier in the day about getting vegetables in. Maybe vegetables at breakfast isn't for you. Well, how about fruit? So maybe get some fruit in at breakfast. And a serving of vegetables is a half a cup of cooked vegetables and a cup of raw vegetables, so like a cup of salad. So when we say you need to have 4 to 5 servings a day, it's really not as huge as it sounds like, because a half a cup is pretty small. So usually, I know if I have a serving of vegetables at lunch, I usually probably have a cup, not just a half a cup of broccoli. I probably would have 2 cups. So bring vegetables to work. Slice up some bell peppers, some cucumbers, and just take those and snack on them on your breaks. You could dip them in some hummus or that black bean dip that I made for you back there as a great snack, or you can spread hummus or black bean dip on a tortilla or some whole grain bread and put your strips of bell pepper, sliced cucumbers, baby spinach, shredded carrots, whatever you want to put on there, and make a great veggie sandwich. Another way to think about it that will help you get more fruits and vegetables in your diet is by making a healthy plate. So when you sit down to eat, think about your plate in terms of this healthy plate. So you'll take your plate, divide it in half, and you'll make half of your plate just vegetables and non-starchy vegetables. And that means starchy vegetables would be like corn, which really is a grain, but we often think of it as a vegetable. Potatoes, those are the starchy vegetables. Doesn't mean you can't have those, but for this half of the plate, make it the non-starchy vegetables like kale and broccoli and those sorts of things. And then on the other half of your plate, you'll want to divide that in half. So 1/4 of your plate will be whole grains, and 1/4 of your plate would be a lean protein, so a low-fat protein. So best if that's a plant protein, but perhaps you're making that a little bit of leaner cuts of meats, like the wild game is leaner. And so proportionally, that would make 1/4 of your plate. And then you would have all the rest of your plate with the plant foods that would give you all of those cancer-fighting nutrients in there. That 1/4 of the plate, though, if you want to make that plant protein as well, then that's even better. And so that could be beans or tofu, something like that. And then have fruit for dessert. Or you could have chocolate tofu mousse, which sounds really weird. And I really wish that I would have made that and brought it, because I make it in my cooking classes, and everyone is like, what? And a lot of times people don't want to try it, but they end up trying it. And they're always just like, oh my gosh, this is so good, give me more. It's really chocolatey, it's really good. It tastes just like chocolate mousse, and you wouldn't know that it had tofu in it if I didn't tell you. It's really good. But I can get the recipe to Sarah so everyone can get that recipe. So it's really good.
What about dark chocolate? The resveratrol and the
yeah.
dark chocolate okay at 70%?
Yeah, dark chocolate's fine. Yeah, like 70% or more. Yeah. Yeah, so hopefully we'll get to do this again and maybe do it with a cooking demonstration, and you'll get to taste more of the foods. That would be great, hopefully. Here's just an example of a healthy plate, kind of what that would look like. A cup of cooked stir-fried vegetables, a half a cup of brown rice, and then 3 ounces of your protein, which might be baked tofu, or maybe it's a half a cup of beans, or maybe it's your lean meat that you might choose there. And then for dessert, you could have a half a cup of blueberries, a quarter a cup of walnuts, and some soy yogurt. And they actually have soy yogurt, actually exists. So. Good question.
If you would get fat-free like Greek yogurt, because I like that. So is it?
It is tasty. I've had it. And remember, we talk about 100% over here, or where are you? And has anyone
stay away from dairy? Like just
the recommendations from what we look at in the research is to avoid dairy as much as possible. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Has anyone heard of the China study? It's a book written by Dr. Colin Campbell. He's a researcher out of Cornell University, and he's getting quite up there, pretty like in his late 80s, I believe. But he's been a scientist researching nutrition and a doctor for a really long time, a medical doctor. And he started out, and you'll have to get the book and read it because it's really fascinating. But he started out as, grew up on a dairy farm, started out as studying nutrition and how do we get more protein in our diet, how do we get more meat in our diet. But through all of the years, eventually this picture was forming at all the research that he started seeing that that wasn't really the way to go. We need to get less protein in our diet. We need to get less animal protein. And a lot of the research that he did focused on, in the later years, really looked at that and examined. And he actually was able to show in research that casein, which is the protein in milk, actually turned cancer genes on. And when no casein was, or actually when the amount of animal protein equaled 5% or less, the cancer genes were turned off. And this was for liver cancer. When the amount of plant protein was high and there was no casein, no animal protein, or very little animal protein, the 5% or less, the cancer genes were turned off. Increase the casein, the animal protein, cancer genes turned on. It's amazing, and it goes into detail of the research studies in the cancer, in the China study. The book is called The China Study. So I highly encourage you to read that if you want to see the science and background on that. It's really fascinating. But anyways, let's talk about dairy a little bit more. Why might dairy not be recommended? What might be the association between dairy and cancer risk? And when we look at milk, for example, and we think about, well, what is milk? What is cow's milk? And what is its purpose? Why does it exist? Anybody?
Calves. To market. I think it's just their marketing money.
So the reason that cow milk exists is to grow a baby calf into a big cow really fast. A calf grows into a big cow pretty quickly. So in that milk, it has hormones, which whether it's organic or not, it's still going to have hormones because it's an animal, so it's going to have hormones. The ones that have added hormones are even worse, right? It also has something in it called growth factors. One of those growth factors is called IGF-1, and there's been a lot of research on that particular one lately. So IGF-1 stands for insulin-like growth factor. I'm kind of going more now into what I do in my cooking classes, but that's okay. But so anyways, insulin-like growth factor is a growth factor, so it stimulates growth. So it helps stimulate the calf to grow into a cow quickly. Well, as a cow, as infants, we need to grow, and we want to have some growth factors in there to help us grow. But as an adult with potential cancer cells in us, we don't want to be promoting growth as adults. We don't want those cancer cells to be encouraged to grow. And when they've done research on this where they took men that have prostate cancer, they take their blood, they measure the amount of IGF-1 in their blood. They take men that don't have prostate cancer, take their blood, measure the amount of IGF-1 in their blood. And what they find is the men with prostate cancer had higher levels of the IGF-1 in their blood, and those without prostate cancer had lower levels. Again, if we look at population studies of Chinese populations that have a lot of, that don't have much dairy intake at all, we see that they have much lower rates of prostate cancer. So there are some things with cow's milk that could potentially be involved in stimulating cancer growth. So that's why we want to try to keep that to a minimum. Okay. So I realize we're kind of getting close to the end, so I think this would be time for questions. Okay. So I think this would be a great time then to just go ahead and move into questions. Yes. Yes.
And if you could just go to the microphone so that the online audience.
If you were standing in front of a group of people that you understood were stage 4 cancer, and they were either on some sort of infusion or daily oral chemo,
Yes.
and they had a time stamp on them, and you were using this information, what kind of message would you, how would there be
That's a
anything
great
else you
question.
would say to that group of people?
That's a really great question, and actually I'm so glad you brought that up, because I wanted to mention in the beginning, and I forgot to do so, that the recommendations that the research report is showing on how we prevent cancer, how we prevent cancer recurrence, this is what most of us want to be trying to do the best that we can. But if you're going through cancer treatment, some of these recommendations aren't going to work for you very well. If you have mucositis, mouth sores from chemotherapy, eating raw broccoli or pasta with tomato-based sauce is going to really irritate those mouth sores, and I don't want you to do that. So if you're going through treatment, you want to just do these recommendations to the level that works for you with the symptoms that you may be having from treatment or from the cancer itself. And hopefully you're working with your dietitian or your healthcare team to develop a diet that's going to work for you with the symptoms that you have to still boost your immune system, to help you fight cancer best that you can, but that's also not going to cause more problems as well. And that's what I do with people that are going through cancer treatment in my private practice. Now, someone in the case that you mentioned, I would probably not be sitting there telling them that you need to eat a fully plant-based diet. I would be telling them, the person that you described, if I have that correctly, you said that they have a prognosis of like a few weeks or a few months or whatever. Yeah, right. So, in that situation, recommendations can be very different that a nutritionist may provide at that point. So it's, we have to work with your doctor and your situation and what's going on for you. And at that point, it may not be about, the main focus may not be about preventing a cancer recurrence. It may be about how do we get nutrition into your body and help you be comfortable and enjoy the rest of your time that you have. And nutrition composes a lot of things, not just what is the most healthy diet for preventing cancer recurrence, but it also means pleasure, it means comfort in eating, it means just providing calories and protein to give your body those essential things that it needs. And so in that situation where I'm working more with an acute or more of a situation where we're not looking at a survivorship for many, many years and preventing recurrence, I would be working more with them on how do we get your nutrition in, to get your calories, to get your protein, to get your healthy fats that you need, and what works with any symptoms you may be having, and that sort of thing. So it really wouldn't be the same conversation that I would be having with that person. So I wouldn't be probably telling them you need to have 100% plant foods in your diet. Does that make sense? Okay. Any other question? Oh, okay.
I was wondering your thoughts on glycemic index. I know you've mentioned potatoes, and I think you might have mentioned corn, but those are ones on my bad list because the glycemic index is above 55.
Okay. Glycemic index was the question, and sort of what is my take on that? And she had heard that corn and potatoes are high on the glycemic index and that sort of thing. The glycemic index is useful in certain situations in helping us eat certain types of carbohydrates as to not spike a raise in our blood sugar too quickly. And when we're talking about nutrition recommendations for someone who has diabetes, that's when it especially becomes important that we want to think about how does the carbohydrates that we eat affect our blood sugar. And so in those cases, I would encourage more of the lower glycemic types of carbohydrates in the concept of still a plant-based diet. But so for that person, not so much of the white potatoes, but more of the sweet potatoes. Yeah, in those cases. So yeah, again, this is kind of general recommendations, but everyone has their own unique situation. And so that's when I sit down with people individually and we kind of go, okay, this is what's going on with you, so how do we put this all together? So, and I think, was there a question here? Did you have a question?
I wanted to ask
Did you want to come up to,
Sure.
please? Thank you.
So I wanted to ask you about your thoughts on coconut oil.
Okay.
Two things, coconut oil and protein powders.
Okay. So, thank you. So the question is my thoughts on coconut oil and protein powder. So on coconut oil, actually I think it's good to have some of it in your diet. It does have some health benefits. It is technically a saturated fat, but it's what we call short chain saturated fat, short chain fatty acid. If we look at butter, which is also a saturated fat, it's actually a long chain saturated fat. And just because of that difference, it behaves differently in our body than butter would behave. So coconut oil actually has some health benefits. Not a bad idea to have some of it in your diet. You don't have to have it, but if you want to, it's certainly fine to have it on a plant-based diet. What we have to be careful with, though, of course, is the amount that we're having. And having a high amount of any fat, I don't care how healthy it is, if we have too much, it does increase our cancer recurrence rates, so just the amount. And then the other question on protein powders. There is really a lot of emphasis in our society on protein, and we gotta have a ton of it. And if you calculate your protein needs, and we don't really have time to go into how to do that, but you would find that it's not near as high as what we might think. Like for me, when I calculate my protein needs, it's about 40 grams of protein a day. That's not a lot of protein. For my husband, who's 6'2", and I don't know how much he weighs, but he's just kind of average, his protein needs are about 75 grams a day. So that's still not a lot of protein. Typical American diet has about 80 to 120 grams of protein a day. So we're already really probably getting more protein than we need. Bodybuilders, the endurance athletes, they're gonna need more protein than that. Or not more than what the typical American diet is, but more than what I would need or my husband would need. But anyways, even the typical American diet pretty much provides the amount of protein that even athletes would need a lot of times. So most of the time, protein powders really aren't necessary. But if someone did have the need to get extra protein in their diet, and they weren't getting it through their diet, which can easily be done on a plant-based diet. But if they needed to add a protein powder, I would recommend a pea protein powder or a brown rice protein powder or a hemp protein powder. Those are some really good sources of protein that you can get in a powder form that would be fine to use. Whey protein is pretty popular, whey protein powder, and that is from dairy. It is a milk protein, so I really don't encourage that. Any other questions?
Egg protein.
Oh, egg protein.
Egg white.
Yeah, and so that too is also an animal protein, which I would encourage not to have that. I would prefer seeing the plant-based proteins. So you might want to try out like a pea protein or brown rice protein. Yeah. There's a couple that you can get at Central Market, Whole Foods, maybe at H-E-B. One of them is called Raw Protein. It's a brown rice protein powder, and one's called Vega, and they use a variety of plant proteins in that one. I'm sorry? The name of one of them is called Raw Protein, and the other one is called Vega, V-E-G-A. V-E-G-A. What other questions do you have? Yes?
Does it make a difference what kind of cooking utensil we use? I mean, is it like aluminum, Teflon? Do those make a difference?
Yeah, if we move into that topic, definitely I would recommend either a cast iron or a stainless steel. Yeah. So stay away from the non-stick coating pans, the Teflon type.
What about tea and coffee?
Tea and coffee are okay. You know, again, it's the amounts that we're looking at. Caffeine, we don't want to have an excessive amount of. So a couple of cups a day are okay. I personally tend to try to go low on the caffeine or even just get decaf tea and decaf coffee. And that's just because I am very sensitive to caffeine, and some people are more sensitive than the others. So I can't handle a lot of caffeine. Any other questions? Yes.
I know we didn't touch a lot on sugar other than the fact the sugary desserts and things like that. I heard that cancer cells feed on sugar.
Okay.
Is that true? And if so, I also heard that vitamin C, that it can trick the cancer cells. It thinks that it's sugar, and that it
Okay.
is a good thing to have vitamin C because of that. I don't know if that's true.
Oh, okay.
So I wanted to ask about it.
Yep. Great question. Well, we definitely know that vitamin C is associated with decreased cancer risk. We absolutely know that. So great to have lots of vitamin C in our diet. Sugar, in a sense, does feed cancer cells, but it also feeds all cells in our body. That's what our primary source of energy for all cells in the body is sugar, is glucose. So it's not so much that we need to keep all sugar out of the diet, but what we need to think about is keeping the processed sugar, the white sugar, and having our sugar, our glucose, coming from complex carbohydrates, whole grains, fruits, vegetables, those sorts of places. So not the refined sugars.
Well, let's give a round of applause for Melissa. Thank you so much.
Thank you.